Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have Christopher Allen Graham. Did not know his middle name till his book came out, or the fact that he was born in North Carolina. I knew that he lived there for a long time. Anyway, Chris Graham is a friend of mine, and he is a fellow historian of the Civil War era. He has a book out. It is his first book. It is called Faith, Race, and the Lost Cause, Confessions of a Southern Church. You can get it from University of Virginia Press. Chris works in Richmond, and his book is based on years of research in the archives. A very well-researched book and a well-written book, and obviously comes on the heels of all the changes that have been going on in the city. The protests that took down the monuments and protested police brutality, Black Lives Matter, all that at the height of COVID that was going on that led to palpable change in the city. All the major monuments are down. I'm not sure how many are left. There's certainly a lot of work to do with renaming streets and schools and all that stuff. But Richmond has certainly changed. It's changed demographically. We're going to talk about that, and has made some improvements in addition under the mayorship of LeVar Stoney. But, it's complicated as always, and race is always going to play a big role in the city's history. So Chris is looking at the history of St. Paul's Church, which is right downtown, near the Capitol, very close to the Capitol, and also close to the former White House of the Confederacy. So it was a place that Jefferson Davis worshipped when he was president of the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee worshipped there, and other high-ranking Confederates. So after the war, it kind of became the unofficial church of the Lost Cause. That was something that peaked in the 1890s. That's when the monuments started to go up in Richmond, and you get a lot of the Confederate memoirs being written around that time, and the Southern Historical Society papers had been published for a while. You get Confederate Veteran, all of these things that get thrown into the mix with the Lost Cause. So Chris is examining the entire history of the church with particular emphasis on how it has responded to Confederate history, how it has grappled with Civil War memory and race relations. Like much of the South, it didn't really start to change until the 1970s. So it took a while, but the South did too, and today the church is still wrestling with these issues, especially in the wake of everything that happened amid the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests. So it is a very good book. I highly recommend it. It is less than 200 pages, so it is a short book, but there is a lot going on in it. It's very informative. So we kind of take a tour of the book, so to speak, go through the history of the church in about an hour or so. But definitely read this book if you're interested in these topics. Very pleased to read it before I talk to Chris. He's been on the podcast before. We talked about drive-by truckers and the monuments, so you can go back and find that if you're interested. So it was good to catch up with him, and always, like to talk with people about their books, especially if it's a first book, because there's nothing quite like getting the first book published. So congratulations to Chris, and he's done an excellent job. So I hope you will enjoy our talk about faith, race, and the lost cause, Confessions of a Southern Church. All right, well, welcome back. This is your second time.
It is. I'm getting up there. I'm getting privileged.
I know. It's like Steve Martin in SNL. You'll be the...
You can have a fancy velvet smoking jacket for me.
I can't even remember when the first one was. 2017, maybe?
Yeah, thereabouts. When I was still over on 21st Street. Which would definitely be more than 3 years ago.
Oh, on 21st Street.
Yeah.
Where were you then? Oh, right, the house that you were renting.
Yeah, that apartment block building. I don't know how you describe it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just everything just seems so long ago sometimes. And at the same time, like it just kind of happened. Cause yeah, I mean, that was all pre-monuments, pre-COVID, all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, congratulations. And it seems like you put this book together fairly quickly, right?
No, actually,
No?
Quickly under the circumstances, perhaps, in that this is not, I'm not teaching. I'm not at a university where you allegedly have time to do that kind of, to devote to that research and writing. This is all done on volunteer time, apart from my day job. And so it did take about 5 years to do the research and the writing, and then another 1.5, 2 years for production.
Okay. So you started.
Does that sound right?
Yeah. So you started, 2017?
Yeah. So when I came to Richmond in 2016, St. Paul's had already undertaken this investigation into its own racial history. And I joined St. Paul's and became involved in that. Lainey's barking at the ice cubes falling in the refrigerator. She's very antsy today. People in the house.
Sometimes I hear that in the middle of the night in our house, and it does freak me out a little bit. I'm like, oh yeah, ice cubes. That's right.
Oh yeah. And after dark, she's out cold. Nothing bothers her. Yeah, where were we?
So you got here 2016.
Yeah.
And then St. Paul's was putting something together.
Yeah, they were beginning the research process, and it wasn't destined that a university press monograph was going to be the outcome, but they were beginning to do the research process on their own racial history. And again, I moved to Richmond for a job at the time, and joined St. Paul's because we're already Episcopalians, and I became aware that St. Paul's was doing this work of examining its own complicity in race and racism, and said, I want to be a part of a church that's doing that kind of work. And so I joined, and they said, hey, you're a PhD historian, man.
Yeah. Well,
you need to be involved, do this.
Okay. So you're sort of doing this in addition to your full-time job.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I mean, obviously you lay out in the book kind of the history of its relationship with race and stuff. But what you're talking about, like, this is now BLM was a thing by then, right? Because what did that? It's hard for me to remember now, like, because obviously once the monuments are coming down and Trump is president, like BLM is front and center. But like it had started before then. What do you know when?
Yeah,
exactly?
I believe that it emerged as a nationally known kind of catchphrase or organization or hashtag about the time of Michael Brown's murder in St. Louis.
Okay.
And that was 2014, okay. I think.
Okay.
I'm sorry for not misremembering. This particular project, and it's a larger project than just the historical research, began at St. Paul's in 2015.
Okay.
After the murders in Charleston. By a young man who was enamored of Confederate history.
Right.
And the week after that happened, the rector at St. Paul's, in a sermon, called the congregation to reconsider the Confederate symbols that appeared in this church and what that says about the church to people who might want to visit or come or join, or what does it put out in the world that there's Confederate iconography in the church. Okay.
So. And so you had a lot of access to their archive.
Yeah. The church has been around since 1844. And so 1844, 1845, and it kind of grew out of Monumental Church, which is an older church in Richmond that was established in early 19th century. My apologies for not having the date right. In downtown Richmond, the congregation at St. Paul's removed itself from Monumental, which the Monumental Church is still there. And Preservation Richmond operates it.
Okay.
And they formed their own church in 1844. It was consecrated in 1845.
Okay.
And so there is a deep historical record. You're asking, opening the church archives. There is so much material that a lot of it is already in the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in the archives there. And so the original minute books from the church are over in VMHC.
Okay.
Now we looked beyond that primary source base into all the other standard ones that you would consult when doing this kind of social history. So we had censuses and newspapers and newsletters and and then referring to the secondary historical work that kind of helped us frame and understand the periods that we were working in.
Okay.
Now there is a rather large accumulation of primary source material at the St. Paul's facility, and if you go there, you'll notice that it takes up half a city block, the north side of the block between 8th and 9th Streets in downtown Richmond. It's on Gray Street, and if you walk out the front door, down the steps of the portico, look to the right, you're going to see the George Washington statue on the Capitol Square down there. It's right there.
Yeah.
In downtown. It's an enormous facility, and over 150 years, coming up on 175 years. I'm not good at math. Deposits of what we would call archival material had accumulated in various closets and corners and boxes and filing cabinets and whatnot. And so part of the project was to kind of gather that together and organize it and get it in one place. And that was mostly 20th century material there. And one of my colleagues and friends, Ann Hayes, who worked on this with me, has taken the lead in organizing that information, organizing that into one room in the building.
Okay. And well, one thing I like about the book is the introduction, because you don't approach it necessarily the way you would in a traditional monograph. You kind of use some first person, which I liked. Maybe talk a little bit about kind of where you situate yourself in this, because you talk about your sort of past as a historian and also a reenactor, interpreter and stuff.
Yep.
But just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. The first thing is that, the first thing to say about this is it's kind of an odd book, is in that it's from an academic press and it's written in kind of an academic format, and it's informed by a lot of great secondary scholarship on American religious history. But we did not attempt to, we're not looking to make a historiographical intervention on Southern history, religious history, lost cause history, 20th century civil rights history. That wasn't the kind of guiding question. And so kind of placing it has been kind of difficult in terms of, I don't know to push this to religious historians or Southern historians or Civil War historians or public historians. I think it's useful there. And so to that end is I'm not trying to make an academic argument. I could dispense with that in the traditional way that it's done in an introduction like this. And because of the public history side of my work, I'm a museum curator at a history museum, and realizing that what's important about this work isn't the historiographical intervention. I keep saying that, but it's not a historiographical intervention. It's supposed to mean something to people today. And it's supposed to have value to lay readers as saying, this church is going through this process. It's a difficult process to understand this painful history. Here's how, this is a good model and guide for what we could possibly do. Okay, so having said that, how do you, Colin, you probably know this better than I do in terms of writing for public audiences, is occasionally you have to get personal.
Yeah.
And you have to insert yourself into the story. And so that's what I did in the introduction. I didn't do that in the body of the work. This isn't a book about me, but the analogy there was that, and why I found it useful was that my own process of growing up, becoming a Civil War reenactor, 95% of the time doing Confederate reenacting Confederate soldiers, and being deeply involved in that hobby for 25, almost 30 years of my life. And then slowly becoming aware that this isn't really a healthy hobby for myself, but also for the history that it puts out in the world and and the way it creates barriers to greater understanding about our communal past.
Well, I mean, and I think, as you say in the introduction, like, you were always pretty careful to not go too overboard with the Confederate stuff. Because, on the one hand, you're doing a Confederate reenactment, but that's part of it because they need both sides. But as I think, you can speak to this, but it's kind of like just the fact that you're doing it in a way is kind of politically incorrect or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we were definitely the reenactors that I associated with were definitely focused on actual good research and good ways of understanding the experience of Confederate soldiers during the war. And we could look across the campfire and look at other reenactors and go, man, those guys are nut rolls over there. They're just in it because they glory in Confederate stuff, and that's not. We're here for the research.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be good historical interpreters, and this is why it connected for me with the St. Paul story is that I thought we were doing good. I thought we were doing right, and as you get into the book, you'll in the last chapter discusses a great transformation in the congregation in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in which the congregation itself really laid the groundwork for breaking with its Confederate history and creating a new identity for the church as a theologically liberal place with people who were not particularly associated with the church because of its Confederate identity, but because it's a place that did a lot of racially conscious outreach in the 70s and 80s. And so by the time this initiative began in 2015, many members of the congregation were like, why do we need to do this? We've been doing it right for 20 years now, and we shouldn't get distracted with this sort of thing. And so that was a parallel to me kind of realizing as a reenactor that, I may have been doing it right, but it was still putting bad stuff out in the world.
Yeah.
And it is an extremely painful process to extract yourself from that kind of community, that kind of, the friendships that you make, the associations that you engage in, the things that you do, as a reenactor or as a church congregation. If you got a Confederate flag over your head while you're doing it, you may not see that. You may not be conscious that that's shaping how people look at you, but it is. And not much good can come of that.
I think,
so extracting yourself from that means essentially maybe breaking up with your friends, your best friends, your comrades in arms, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't want to over romanticize that, but people that are your best friends, you got to stop hanging out with them, and it hurts. And for a congregation that's been around for 150 years that thinks well of its history, even though it is not conscientiously being a neo-Confederate church, it's painful to realize that, hey, man, maybe that history wasn't that great.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of pair those things together in the introduction to say that, I've been going through the same process, and it ain't easy.
Yeah.
Here's why it might not be easy.
Well, and also to further complicate the story, you're from Virginia originally, although Northern Virginia, which again
raised in Northern Virginia.
In Northern Virginia. Where were you actually born?
Durham, North Carolina.
Okay, so you're you're a North Carolinian, if you want to put it that way. So you spent a lot of time in the South. You're a native Southerner. I don't know if that necessarily, adds weight to it. Probably does, because I think you rightfully thought yourself as more progressive than probably most Southerners even when you're doing the reenactments and everything.
Born and raised in the South, but my mom's family's from Kentucky, my dad's family's from Connecticut. They were a military family.
Yeah.
Moved around. So, I grew up in a place of strip malls and tract housing, and it wasn't a place that was deeply rooted in its own history, and there were no Confederate monuments in Woodbridge, Virginia. And so And so, you know, to some extent it was easier because I didn't have to break up with my family to get out of Remond. You know, to take a new view of history.
Yeah. Well, and maybe this is happening a bit more, but like, I think with a lot of academic books now, it's more okay to put yourself in it and talk in the first person a little bit, even if it's just in the introduction. Because I think, at least where I went to school, like, that was verboten. I mean, you were not supposed to put yourself in the story ever. And usually it was a really heavy historiographical dive in the beginning of whatever kind of work you were doing.
Yeah.
So you've kind of pulled away from that. And I think that's a good thing, not just for the reader, but also I think it adds to the story to kind of put yourself there and say, you know, I'm not just floating in the ether. I mean, I've been involved in these things on the ground, but you're kind of showing an evolution, which I think is a good thing, and that certainly coincides with what the church is trying to do. So right. I mean, I think again we're all kind of part of this general historical trend that's been happening with people that are forward looking. Obviously, we've gone in the other direction a lot too lately, but it's like you said, the church has kind of been doing this the last 40, 50 years, really, right? Trying to kind of reconcile with its history, which we need to go into more, because there is this very strong historical connection to the Confederacy that St. Paul's has.
Sure.
Maybe talk about that.
Yeah. Talk about the connection.
Like, why we're talking about St. Paul's is because of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. Yeah, primarily.
St. Paul's became known over time as by a variety of names. The Church of the Confederacy. Some people less often call it the Cathedral of the Confederacy. But it was most commonly known as in print throughout most of the 20th century as, quote, the church where Lee and Davis worshipped. And of course, in Virginia, you don't have to explain who Lee and Davis are.
Right.
We're talking about Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. So, and so the church, since the end of the Civil War, has been essentially a tourist attraction, a stop on the, if you want to do Civil War Richmond, you come to St. Paul's because this is the place where all the Confederate High Command worshipped. All the Episcopalians amongst Confederate High Command worshipped because of its location and because the church itself really embraced that identity. And they did it in several ways. One was in the 1890s and in the first decade of the 20th century, many of the downtown churches were beginning to move out of downtown into the West End. But St. Paul's, made a decision to say, hey, this is a historic church where it is. We can't move. We have to stay here. And so part of that was that they started the endowment, which started small but grew over the 20th century to help the church become as wealthy as it is today. And at the same time, they installed various memorials around the sanctuary. It was a time when a lot of churches were beginning to put up plaques and stained glass memorial windows. Stained glass windows, whether they were, just of saints or medieval scenes or whatever. Stained glass was in style in the last quarter of the 19th century, and they installed memorial windows to Jefferson Davis and to Robert E. Lee. And they put plaques up to Davis and his family, smaller plaques to Lee, and marked the pews where Davis sat and where Lee sat when they were at the church during the war. Now, it should be said that, Lee wasn't, in Richmond every Sunday.
Right.
So he couldn't be. Yeah, he attended when he could. Davis was a more regular attendee of the church because he lived a couple blocks away from it.
Was he Episcopalian?
Well, here's the thing: is he wasn't before, but he became one during his time in Richmond and the rector of St. Paul's kind of shepherded his process into becoming an Episcopalian. The term for that has slipped my mind at the moment. So yeah, he became a devoted churchman during the war at St. Paul's. Of course, neither one of them ever came back after the war, but those 4 years and all that elite white Richmond found tragic and honorable in the Confederate experience, they wrapped it up in the personalities of Lee and Davis. Of course, again, Davis has a closer relationship with the church, but in Virginia, you can't mention anyone without also mentioning Lee.
Yeah.
And so when a moment came in 1889 for the church to undergo some serious renovations, because it was getting old and moldy at that point, and the vestry said, okay, we're going to extend the altar, put in new lights, and we're going to start doing stained glass windows because they're pretty and we like them. And we want to be up to speed like everyone else. And they installed 5 windows around the altar for the founding generation to honor the founding generation of the church. And right at that moment, Jefferson Davis died. And they said, well, now's our chance. This man needs a memorial. So we're going to do memorial windows to Jefferson Davis. And of course, again, in Richmond, Virginia, you can't mention anyone without mentioning Lee. So there's like, well, obviously we're going to do Lee as well.
So that's the 1890s they finally went in?
Yeah. 1890, the Lee windows went in. That was easy because one family, who were not members of the church, but associated with the Lee family, one family paid for them.
Okay. They
did a fundraising effort for the Davis family because the Davis family was not all that well off at the time.
Yeah.
And it took them 10 years to raise that money.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those were installed in 1898.
I think I've only been in St. Paul's maybe once, and I think I was looking I went in to see whatever was related to the Lost Cause, essentially.
Right, yeah.
This is many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But the stained glass windows, it's not Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis in the window, right? So maybe just kind of describe like what they did, what the windows actually were.
Sure. It's often related that the figures in the windows are meant to be a conflation of Lee and Moses and Davis and St. Paul, the Apostle Paul. But they're not. In the tremendous archival record at the church, we do have the correspondence with the manufacturers of the windows, Henry Holliday in England and Tiffany for the Davis one.
Okay.
Neither one of them says we want Davis to look like Paul and Lee to look like Moses. They never say that.
Okay.
And so despite what you might hear, they're not meant to be Lee and Davis in the windows.
Okay.
Now, the thing is that they do depict biblical scenes about Moses and about Paul that overlay the stories they were telling themselves about Lee and Davis at the time extremely well. And that is not in the historical record to say, here's why we chose this particular scene to be depicted to memorialize Lee and Davis. But you look at them and you can tell. The window for Lee depicts Moses leaving Pharaoh's house after he was offered a high position in Pharaoh's family, leaving Pharaoh's house because he would rather be with his people and suffer afflictions with them.
Okay.
And that is exactly the story they were telling about. Lee was so honored in his day that he was offered command of the Union Army, and he turned it down to go with his afflicted people.
Right.
Now, of course, that's the hindsight in that is just unbearable.
Moses leading his people out of bondage, and then
yeah.
It's a huge stretch.
Yeah, and certainly
metaphorically,
if they were even aware of the place of Moses in the Black Christian tradition, they never left any indication that they did. So it was just a major blind spot in there to make this connection. It made sense to them, but it exposes something. And the Davis window depicts Paul before Herod Agrippa, before he shipped off to Rome for ultimately his execution. And he is shown kind of pleading the cause of Christ to Agrippa, the client Jewish king of the Roman Empire in Judea. And in that passage from the Bible, Agrippa says, after hearing Paul's evangelism, says, I don't think this man's done anything wrong, and he might be right about this. And so if you look at Jefferson Davis's post-war career, he made a couple stabs at getting into business, but it never really worked out for him. So he spent the rest of his life, his last 30 some years, working to vindicate the Confederate cause. And he and the people around him would always say, it's like, I don't care what the world thinks. I'm going to say that we were right. And because we were right, the world will have to face the fact that we were right. And in the process of thinking about it that way, they say, well, it's clear that we have proven ourselves right, which is the same thing as Davis pleading the cause of the Confederacy to the larger United States world, is the same as Paul pleading the cause of Christ to Agrippa, of saying, I don't think this guy's done anything wrong. More glory to him. And the key thing there, and the other kind of blind spot irony on that window, is that in the scene of Paul, he has chains hanging from his wrists. You have to look before you notice them, but they're there. You can see the chains. And ex-Confederates got a lot of juice off the fact that Jefferson Davis was imprisoned in chains for almost 2 years after the war.
Right.
And one of the few, if only, Confederate leaders who ever had, there was a prison camp commander who was executed for war crimes. But Davis was the only Confederate that was ever imprisoned for these actions. And ex-Confederates looked at him and said, he has suffered for us. See, he's wearing chains. And so kind of the conflation between Davis and the Paul story is in its meaning is right there, even if it's not actually depicting Jefferson Davis as St. Paul.
Okay.
And of course, once again, like with the Moses thing, they never saw a problem with saying that, here our leader, to their shame and his glory, was in chains. Have they ever thought about slavery? I have no idea what they did. If they made that connection.
It's the blinders on this is just astounding. But this is like peak lost cause, right? So they're going in the 1890s after Lee is on Monument Avenue at that point. Davis not yet, because he's 20th century, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't get more peak lost cause than this. But as you showed, and I guess when I went in years ago, I was kind of expecting it to be a likeness of Lee and Davis, and it probably went over my head because I didn't know the backstory.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's just dripping with symbolism and metaphor.
It gets complicated on that, and people can still see those figures in the Davis window. Paul is depicted as a gaunt figure, with kind of a scraggly, kind of unshaven look. And if you look at a photograph of Jeff Davis, he was very gaunt. In the way he looks. The lower window for Robert E. Lee shows a young Moses who has spectacular abs but looks nothing like Robert E. Lee. But the upper window in the gallery above that does show Moses as an aged man. He has seen the Promised Land, but he's not able to make it in.
Okay.
So Lee died in 1870.
Yeah.
He was unable to see the day that the South was vindicated. But that Moses was a stock, older Moses with long white hair and a long white beard. And if you know anything about Robert E. Lee, he's noticed for his distinguished white beard.
Right, right.
The visual culture of Robert E. Lee is this distinguished white beard and his snowy hair and whatnot. And so people can look at that and see Lee, but it's just not.
Yeah.
It's just not.
Okay. So. Okay. And by this point, Lee has already kind of been deified in so many ways. I'm not sure when the recumbent Lee was put in Washington and Lee, but that's...
I don't know off the top of my head. I think 10 to 15 years after his death.
Okay. Yeah. So, certainly, this is all kind of building up. And in some ways, this is a lot more subtle than a huge statue on Monument Avenue.
Oh, yeah.
Other depictions of him. This is somewhat subtle, but, the point is the same.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting how you have a religious space that becomes a lost cause space, which is in a way, it's kind of its own religion. There's so many religious aspects to it.
Oh, yeah. And that was the interesting thing, is kind of going through. So this book looks at from 1845 to the present time. And what we see is different ways of understanding religious faith and how to do lived religion on a daily basis, and the ways that's connected with race, slavery, but also Civil War memory. In that, in the antebellum period, in the pre-emancipation period, we have people that are practicing a faith that identifies slavery and racial bondage as an instruction from God, as a godly thing to participate in. And there's right ways of doing it. right ways of doing slavery. And that, for them, part of slavery, and I believe they believed this. I don't think this was, they were just making themselves feel better, is that they were practicing a slavery that created that in their prescription would create close personal bonds between the enslaver and the enslaved, in which they both have obligations to each other. And one of their obligations was that that enslavers would bring the enslaved to a proper religion. And they worked on doing that with Sunday schools and invitations to join churches. The Episcopal Church was never good at getting black people, enslaved or free, to join it in the antebellum period or any time since.
Is that because it's considered like high Protestant, and maybe it's sort of like the religion of the elite?
Oh yeah, it's the Episcopal Church is a liturgical church. If you've ever been to a Catholic Mass, the Sunday service is pretty much the same thing.
Right.
And so there's times you stand, times you kneel, times you sing, times you sit. And
again, the space itself is very important. Like, you called it the Cathedral of the Lost Cause.
Cathedral of Confederates, yeah.
So it's kind of, the space is very important. So, and especially in the Deep South, I mean, you're talking Methodist, Baptist, whatever, like, they're in fields with nothing, or what, or like a sort of ramshackle physical space maybe translates better to the enslaved population because they are taking it into the fields with them or wherever, like they have their own part of the church, whereas Episcopalians, they can't kind of do that logistically in the same way.
They're small in number in the American South and generally concentrated in urban areas. And
right.
And wealthy urbanites. And so, when Episcopalians in Richmond build a church, and frankly, when Baptists and white Baptists and Methodists in Richmond build a church, it's going to be, the antebellum period is going to be a grand Grecian temple type thing. But certainly when you get out into rural areas in the countryside, white Baptists and Methodists and to some degree Presbyterian churches are a little more plain, so to speak.
It's just about the people gathering, really.
And that goes for congregations of black people, whether they were plantation congregations or they were black people were attending by choice or by force churches that white people were involved in as well. But there was no real Episcopalian presence in the countryside.
Yeah. Okay. So, that makes sense. Now, there's a famous story about Robert E. Lee and an African American. I don't know if is he a congregant, or what would you call him? Just sort of a visitor? Talk about that story, because I had heard about this before we even met, I think, and then doing my own work on the Lees. But then you were talking about it online or whatever. Maybe we had a talk, but it's there's serious doubt to this story. So maybe talk about this Robert E. Lee story that takes place at St. Paul's.
Yeah, the key to this isn't what the man was, but what you would call him, or what I would call him, or what someone in 1905 would call him, or what someone in 1965 would call him.
Okay.
Okay. And that may be an enigmatic way to start the story.
So when does this, I guess we'll just start the basics. Like, when does this supposedly happen?
In 1905, a man named Thomas Brown, a Confederate veteran, and he was living in Martinsburg, West Virginia at the time, a railroad executive. And but he visited Richmond a lot, and I think his daughter married the St. Paul's organist or something like that. So he had a connection to St. Paul's. And so he wrote, someone from the Times-Dispatch wrote an article that said, isn't it, I feel like we've heard all the stories that there are available about Robert E. Lee. There just aren't any new Robert E. Lee stories lately. And Thomas Brown was like, hold my beer, I got one for you. And so what he described was, he claimed to witness this. He claimed to be in the congregation at this time. He said in the weeks after the surrender at Appomattox, there was a service, the Sunday service at St. Paul's, and when the call for communion was given out, it's like when you start going up to receive communion at the altar rail, is that the first thing that happened was a proud and aggressive black man jumped up and pushed his way to the front and knelt down. And the congregation was nervous, didn't know this was certainly a revolution in race relations, and when the congregation was kind of frozen, not knowing what to do, Robert E. Lee rose, walked calmly to a front, knelt down next to the man, and by his, I'm using my own words to describe the way that Thomas Brown described it. By Lee's ignoring of the man, he silenced the man and helped restore for the congregation a sense that the racial order would be preserved and we would not have to deal with this kind of intrusion in the future. Now, that may not be how you've heard the story today, because that is usually told as a story of Lee expressing humility and racial tolerance and an accepting of the new realities of post-emancipation Southern life. And it is a guide or an example that everyone can follow to be racially tolerant like Robert E. Lee. And certainly even people at St. Paul's used that story to try to break the ice in the 70s when they were really doing good work and trying to understand their own place in the racial world.
Okay.
And commune with Black Richmonders at the same time. And so what's interesting about that story is that how it's been used by different people over time. So Thomas Brown and his generation used it to say that we're okay as long as we have men like Lee to maintain the racial order. Interestingly, Black historians in the 1920s and 1930s used the story to say that Lee was extending the hand of friendship in this act, and it represents what could have been in Southern race relations after the war, but didn't turn out to be.
Okay.
In the 1950s and 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, a variety of people, journalists like Ralph McGill out of Atlanta, influential Southern liberal journalist in the Civil Rights era, and Billy Graham, of all people, kind of took the story and said, let's use a Lee story against the segregation South and really play up the whole concept of this was Lee being racially tolerant and opening the door for integration, which is what McGill and Billy Graham were advocating for in the early 1960s. And so they said, well, look, your all's hero, Robert E. Lee, can integrate a church.
Right.
Why can't you?
Okay.
You should do this.
But there's doubt that this even happened anyway.
Yeah. The thing is that 1905 was the first time that it ever shows up in the historical record.
Okay.
And, but going back and looking at the historical record, newspapers, private correspondence, anything from the couple of summer months between the time that Lee returned from Appomattox to Richmond to the time he left Richmond to stay at I forget where he went, somewhere out in the countryside, stayed at someone's house before he took up his position as president of Washington College.
Right.
He was in town for a couple of months. And, and the thing is that there were newspaper reporters everywhere watching him because he there was a threat of indictment by the federal government. And so all the reporters were kind of following him around, waiting for this indictment to come down. And they wanted to kind of be there when it happens to see what, they would probably love to have seen him carried off in chains himself. And so they were watching him. And he did a number of things. And so there's documented stories of him kind of responding to groups of ex-soldiers in the streets of Richmond and talking to them. There's other stories of what he was eating for dinner and where he was getting his food from. And there's even one story in a New York newspaper that described him in St. Paul's. And they said, well, there he is. I saw him. He was wearing this kind of suit of clothes, and you could see his white hair and white beard, and he was bowing his head and standing and kneeling and taking communion with everyone else, wasn't really standing out or anything. If this had happened, it would have got noticed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because they noticed everything else about him during that time.
Yeah.
If this had happened, it would have got noticed and written up.
Okay.
And it never did.
Okay.
And so I firmly believe that it did not happen at all. The only question is, what did Thomas Brown think in 1905 he was remembering?
Right. Yeah,
I don't know the answer.
Yeah, well, you can contextualize it, I guess, however you want. I mean, this is sort of like the triumph of white supremacy at that point, because they've got the new state constitution, right?
Yeah, 3 years before, yeah.
Jim Crow, and so maybe, this is just sort of the cherry on top in terms of all that, just collective memory kind of owning that. But as you said, I mean, it's 40 years after the fact, and maybe some actual reputable Lee historians have kind of repeated this, but you quoted, I think, Douglas Liddell Freeman said it probably didn't happen.
Yeah, Freeman didn't
and anyone at this
and
point,
Virginia Dabney didn't think it happened.
So to this point, to say that this did happen, regardless of your interpretation, would be kind of a big faux pas.
Yeah. And certainly, you know, another kind of contextualizing response to that is that this isn't just straight, how we put it, this isn't just a straight veneration of Confederate heroes, but this is world building. And this is world building in a way that is more than just looking back on the past to, you know, to think well of it, but world building in a way that creates the historical imagination for what's possible and what should be done now and in the future. And so at the same time as this alleged story in which, you know, they didn't use the word, but, you know, we can kind of ironically, you know, in quotations, an uppity black man, you know, showed himself in church. This is a time where they were the white people that are controlling the dominant cultural narratives were defining how black people should behave. And that would be in a deferential fashion, and not assertive and not aggressive as this man allegedly had been. But they would turn around so the white authors of the Lost Cause and the broader Southern cultural narrative, you know, would look in the past and say, man, the slaves were happy and loyal and they did not betray us during the war. Well, they did. They didn't want, they don't want to admit it, but they would turn around and say, therefore, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're loyal to them now as they continue to work in our homes, nurse our children, cook our meals, and tend to our every need. Is that we have a responsibility in the here and now in the 1910s and 1920s to be responsible paternalists.
Yeah.
In how we engage with our black servants today.
And it seems like you talk about the 1920s and the social gospel, that kind of continues, right? I mean, it's progressive in a sense, but it's all within Jim Crow society, Jim Crow expectations. But I don't know, maybe describe that process that's going on in the 1920s.
Yeah, sure. And this gets back to kind of what I was mentioning earlier about kind of there's like theological regimes that they're operating in the context of. So we've got pro-slavery Christianity in the antebellum period. In the post-war period, they largely, their racial paternalism goes slightly dormant in favor of the civil religion of the Lost Cause. And so, you know, these men, Lee, Davis, Jackson, Stewart, were exemplar. They interpreted them as exemplars of good Christian manhood. You know, none of them were particularly good examples of Christian manhood, but they interpreted it that way. So in the 1920s, we kind of bring that up to speed. They kind of bring racial paternalism back into it when they adopt the social gospel. And if you're unfamiliar with the social gospel, it's something that comes out of northern urban areas. And theologians there, folks like Walter Rauschenbusch, oh, I'm getting that name right, Washington Gladden, and men kind of interpret the gospel as something that should drive you to address the ills of society and to do it with the most up-to-speed methods of the new social sciences. So ethnography, sociology, social work, statistics. Two key things is that the social gospel defined earthly problems, whether it's poverty, sickness, or racism, as man-made problems.
Okay.
As problems that are produced by the sin of man. Whereas 2 generations before in pro-slavery Christianity in the American South, these racial divisions are something that God has ordained. Now it's something that God looks down on. Okay. I've forgotten what the second point is.
Well, I guess, you know, this is new. You know, we talked about in grad school, the 20s is a new era. So these new ideas kind of about science, sociology, as I think you said. So this sort of gets wrapped up into, racial politics too, I guess. But it's
Right.
it is still, it's kind of paternalism and maybe in a new guise. Is that safe to say?
Yeah.
Maybe trying to be more scientific.
Yeah.
Not in a bad way with junk science or anything, but
There
addressing
was a lot of junk science, no,
they're not doing phrenology necessarily, but
right. But they are doing eugenics.
Okay. But this is, after World War I.
Yeah.
So, kind of new ideas coming forth and, trying to better urban areas because you have cities are bigger than they've ever been. You have problems with poverty and urban disease and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So I guess this kind of filters in 1920s.
Yeah,
when
and
Richmond
so you get a lot of St. Paul's people that are going out and advocating on behalf of black people and with black people. And that's what's different this time. This time they're doing it by sitting down with black people to talk about what are the problems with the racial division in our society and how can we address them. And so we have St. Paul's people that are involved in the interracial cooperation movement in the 1920s and 1930s. And they are using social sciences to kind of look at Richmond and say, where's the bad housing? Where's the unhealthful housing? Where's the need to alleviate poverty? Where's the need for better medical care? And these are in black communities. And how can we leverage our power and the city government to address those issues? And the thing is that on first glance, it's unexpected and surprising, and you might go, "Hey, good on you, white people! Really getting out there and saying, don't pass that segregation law. Instead, what you should do is put sewers in the black neighborhoods." And they did that. They went to City Hall and said, "Don't pass that segregation law, and you should put sewers in black neighborhoods." But the reason they're doing it is because, one, they feel they have this paternalistic obligation, and two, because they want segregation to work the way they thought it should work.
Right. Because
they really thought that separate could be equal. And they looked around and they said, well, right now separate is not equal. Let's make it equal.
Yeah.
This is our obligation as white people to make this work right. And of course, never in the course of these 20 or so years that the interracial cooperation movement operated, did these white people ever sit down and go, maybe it is segregation that's the problem?
No, I know. I mean, it's all sort of...
Maybe it is our racism and our paternalism that's the problem.
It's all there to support white supremacy at the end of the day.
But it moves this generation in a direction that is so far removed from the antebellum period.
Right.
And you see that every generation or so. Things move. But also you got to watch out for that, because you look back on it and you might say, oh yeah, they were doing good.
Yeah.
But no, they weren't. They were reinforcing their sense of racial paternalism and their own obligation to that, and believing their own benevolence, and their own self-proclaimed benevolence, and not particularly listening to black people.
No, and I mean, as we've said, like, there is no real. I mean, in terms of the African American population that's involved with St. Paul's, even just attending, there's not many, right?
No, there were a small handful in the antebellum period that are mentioned in the minute books, and they are free black people who attended church, and there was never more than 5 at a time in a congregation of several hundred, and we just don't know enough about them to know why they made the choices they did. They just showed up on the list. After the war, it did not happen. After emancipation, it did not happen, and black people did not start attending St. Paul's congregates again until the 1970s, so the early 1970s.
And so this isn't even like other Southern churches where maybe there's a black section and there's a white section. There's no black section because there's no black people at all.
You have caught me in a mistake. I said that wrong. Let me put it another way. There were members of the church on their own, for their own purposes, who were black in the antebellum period, and not again until the 1970s. Now, there are galleries in the church, so seating up on the second floors, And that was the west end of the galleries was reserved for the drivers, the nurses, the people tending to the kids.
Okay.
So there usually is a black presence, but these are people that are in the church because they drove the white people there and they just needed a place to sit.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. That's
sorry.
a good detail.
Yeah, sorry,
no. Well, but I mean, it's different
embarrassing.
If you're the help versus you're a member.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
That's a big
absolutely.
difference.
Yeah.
So, okay. And I mean, this doesn't really change until the late 60s.
Right.
The situation. So talk about that transition.
Well, what's interesting is taking this long view of the church, you see generations where they do what you expect. You see so like in the antebellum period, they're wealthy, many of them enslaved people. They practice a pro-slavery Christianity. In the late 19th century, they get carried away with the lost cause, and it's the civil religion of Confederate memory that's enacted in the church and in the way the church operates on a daily basis. In the 1920s and 1930s, they get deeply involved in progressive movements. Now, Southern white progressive movements are really on one side of the progressive spectrum, very paternalistic and very conservative, but they're actually doing things that their Confederate grandfathers could not possibly have imagined in regards to race relations. After that generation in the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s, the church becomes as conservative as it ever had been in terms of their outlook on race relations. And part of that was because the thing that's happening in the 1920s, 1930s with the interracial cooperation movement is that white people will work for what they regard as the benefit of black people, as long as they can control the terms of that relationship. All right. What happens in the and so if that's how it's going to work, if black people are going to defer to white people in race relations, then white people are happy to be relative liberals in that cause. What happens is that not much changes because the white people are in charge. And so beginning in the late 1940s here in Richmond, you start seeing the beginnings of what becomes the modern civil rights movement in terms of direct action campaigns, voting drives, and whatnot. By the time this emerges, particularly after Brown in 1954, as a full-on black-directed direct action civil rights movement that does not defer to white people, the white people are like, "Oh, I'm out. No, this is not for this is not for us."
Yeah,
this happened at St. Paul's. Their engagement with issues regarding race relations in the 1940s and 1950s was non-existent, and they stopped doing the things that were regularly happening. Biracial meetings, race relations Sundays that were happening in the 1920s and 1930s. By the 40s and 50s, they're like, "No, we're not doing that here. We're not going to do that." And so they, like most mainline white churches in the South during the civil rights period, is that they become extremely complacent and to the point of being, they were always part of the problem, but complacent to the point of not doing anything.
Yeah.
Now, this changes in 1969 when it's a different part of the civil rights movement, and they're not in St. Paul's, not necessarily trying to catch up with the civil rights movement, but something happens. They get a new rector, a young, ambitious dude, John Shelby Spong. If you've heard that name,
it looks like sponge. I'm glad.
Right. Spong, Spong. Yeah. Jack Spong, after his time at St. Paul's, went to become the Bishop of Newark and a outspoken advocate for liberal causes in the Episcopal Church, from race relations, but particularly to the ordination of women during the 1970s.
Where is he from?
1980s. He's from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay.
I believe Charlotte, North Carolina, but he'd come out of a church in eastern North Carolina where in the mid-60s he had been threatened by the Klan and their Confederate flags for some moderate interracial work that he was doing in the early 60s. Went to a church in Lynchburg and then came here to Richmond.
Okay.
And And so he comes in with speaking of kind of the theological regimes, he is in this kind of post-World War II universal Christian theology in which everyone is equal, racism is straight up bad. Whereas, in the 1920s, 1930s, we can say we can be separate but equal. The racial divisions are unfortunate, but we can make this work out. Now theology is saying, no, it's just wrong. This is wrong.
Okay.
And Spong comes in with that. And so he is not in the least bit enamored with the Confederate history. As a man of his time, he will pay deference to it when he needs to. But in terms of the rituals, in terms of the associations, bringing in the UDC to have, tableau vivants and whatnot in the church, or flying the Confederate flag on Lee's birthday, the way St. Paul's did, he just wasn't in for that. He wasn't up for that. And in fact, he made a statement in 1970 when it came time to roll out the Confederate flag for Lee's birthday. He's like, if you do this, I'm just not going to show up that day. And so they didn't do it. But more importantly, he was an evangelist, and he began to draw in new members of the church, young people, people that had no connection to St. Paul's, people that were sympathetic, if not outright active in the civil rights movement. And he began drawing them in with a vibrant, evangelical program for young people and bringing people in. And on top of that, he initiated a tremendous outreach effort, using some of the church's income and wealth. He began what was called the Isaiah program in 1971, 72, in which the church spent great deals of money granting in block grants to alleviate the needs of poverty and racial division in Richmond. And so they were funding healthcare centers in Fulton. They were funding entire kind of open high schools for homeless kids in downtown Richmond.
Okay.
So that's when you get new people coming into the church that say, I want to be involved in St. Paul's because that's a church that is acting on its beliefs in a liberal way. And over the course of the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of that outreach and a lot of the initiatives that many of those members undertook were very conscientiously directed toward the problem of racial division in Richmond at the time. Yeah.
Are new black people coming in, or is this still mostly a white discussion?
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. It's still,
okay. Right. That's what I figured, but
Yeah. It's white. It always has been. It still is. Since I've been attending the church since 2016, there's always been black members.
Yeah.
And black leaders. So Barbara Holly, was the senior warden. She just finished her term up as senior warden of the church. And so.
Okay. How long? Spong doesn't last very long, though, does he?
Yeah, he leaves. He gets called to be a bishop. In 76, 77. I think he was there like 8-9 years. The subsequent rectors the subsequent rector continued his tradition of intense outreach and activism.
He was at St. Paul's for 9 years?
Spong was, yeah.
Okay.
I think it may have been 7 or 8.
Okay, that's a pretty good. Called to be bishop. That's what I'm waiting for. I want to be called to the next big thing, and it just hasn't happened yet.
And I'm a historian. I'm not good with dates and numbers, so
they're overrated. Okay, so things.
As long as you know that one thing happened after the other.
Yes, there you go.
That's where the meaning.
But
is.
in reality, you know a ton of dates. It's just you don't want to kill people with them, but I get it. So okay, so things are kind of changing in the 70s as Richmond generally, I guess, is changing. I mean, it's a slow process. I mean, you're not really talking about palpable integration till the late 70s or 80s, if it ever happens in certain places.
And it's almost a bit of an understatement. The way you put it is that in Richmond, the way that the population of Richmond became majority black in late 60s, early 70s.
Okay.
And part of that was, of course, due to white flight out into the neighborhoods and because of Virginia's what's that rule? The Dillon rule. Certain municipalities only govern those municipalities.
Right. Richmond is Richmond.
Richmond is Richmond. Yeah. Henrico and Chesterfield are other places.
Well, let me just talk about that real quick, because I found it interesting. You talked about there was going to be a possible merger, if you want to call that, between Henrico and Richmond City, which would have made Richmond one of the biggest cities in the country if that had happened. Yeah. Didn't happen because the African American community didn't want that to happen, or they were against it mostly.
No, I wouldn't say they were necessarily against it. I don't think anyone was challenging the Dillon rule.
Okay.
So I think that there was never any threat of Richmond actually combining with Henrico County.
You did talk about it in the book, though. Do you remember?
Well, there was an effort by some Richmonders, including some people at St. Paul's, to counterbalance the now majority black population by annexing a portion of Chesterfield County.
A portion of okay.
And so kind of the Bel Air area out past Forest Hills.
Yeah.
Bon Air.
Excuse me. Right.
Out past Forest Hills was part of that annexation to try to rebalance the racial order. And along with that was a different way of doing city elections. And I may be getting this wrong, but to describe it as, I think the way it was is that all the seats before 1970s were at-large seats. And so if you have a white majority, you can elect all white candidates. Okay. But after the 1970s, it involved a Supreme Court case in which actually city elections in Richmond were suspended for a number of years to get a case through the Supreme Court. It established when they began having city elections again, it was on the ward district kind of breakdowns. And so, East End is guaranteed, because its majority black population, is guaranteed a black representative.
Yeah.
Jackson Ward area,
right.
Same thing. West End is going to have its white representative. South Side is going to split.
Okay.
And so this is what was important about St. Paul's conscientious embrace of addressing racial issues in the late 70s was because of all that. When they restored elections to Richmond, first majority black council, first black mayor, Henry Marsh. And it was a tense and fraught racial dynamic in the city at the time. And observers in that moment were even saying this is as bad as it was during Reconstruction. Not that anyone in 1979 was alive in 1866.
It's a handy metaphor.
But they weren't wrong.
Yeah.
And so a lot of St. Paul's initiatives, the Richmond Forum, the Ben Campbell's work, were all intended to try to overcome some of that tension from the late 70s and early 80s.
And since, I don't know when it was, 2010 or whatever, the demographics have shifted again. It's now a majority white population in Richmond.
Right.
It's still about 50-50, but it's shifted in the first time in that way since the early 70s.
I don't know the details, but it's definitely moving back toward a majority white city, and it's because of people like me, who moved here.
And the population generally has increased, and it's white people moving in.
Yeah.
It's not like we've lost population, which is a good thing, but it's kind of going in the direction of younger white people, I guess, or mid-career, whatever you want to call them. But I find it interesting that Richmond is still Richmond, Henrico is Henrico. I guess that'll probably never change in our lifetime. I'm guessing it kind of just comes back to maybe just home rule. It's like Richmond would be worried if they combine with Henrico, or even worse, Hanover.
I was
get a very different people making the rules there.
Here's a dumb analogy and observation. I was listening to some lectures on the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and historians who were doing oral history interviews of people in Germany who were active at the time, and Germany and Poland, would say that we fought against communists our entire lives. We never believed we would see the day that this would happen in 1989. And it's, nothing short of a miracle. So we're sitting here in Richmond and going, man, the racial order that they established with the Dillon rule and other things in the early part of the 20th century, I'm never going to see the end of that in my lifetime.
Yeah.
That's going to last longer than the Soviet Union.
I know.
And I hope it ends at some point.
Well, and to me, it would make more sense to just kind of pool resources because, I mean, Richmond, it's been tough enough at certain times, but like a place like Petersburg has just been getting decimated because they're an island of poverty and hardship mostly, and with much larger, the story down there. I mean, it's a perfect example of segregation, kind of post-segregation. But Richmond, I guess, will muddle along, but other places in Virginia, I feel like they're really suffering out of that. Yeah. But again, white counties that don't want any of the problems. They don't want the poverty. They don't want the crime. So
what they perceive as the poverty and the crime.
Right. Right. I mean, again, I did not grow up in this. I had their own issues where I'm from, but like a county was just a county and a city would be part of that. It kind of made sense. Yeah. But
it's that way in Durham.
Yeah.
But, and also when I was growing up in Northern Virginia in the 1980s is, God, the way Northern Virginia politicians talk about D.C. was some of the most racist nonsense and fear mongering that I didn't think of it much then, but I look back on it now and go, oh my God, what they were doing.
I know.
I can't believe it. Well, I can't believe it, but
some places are just very isolated here. So things are changing in the 70s. Kind of where, maybe talk to kind of wrap up, like, what's the process coming from, Obama, you're having protests over whatever was going on that week in terms of police brutality or whatever, leading up to the huge protests and the monuments coming down. Like, okay, church starts putting kind of this project together.
Sure.
Where's it at now? I mean, the book is out. A lot of things have changed in Richmond, but what's kind of the status of St. Paul's now? What's it trying to do in terms of racial reconciliation or future plans? I don't know.
Yeah. We're still trying to figure that out ourselves. That's the short version of the story.
Yeah.
One of the things that one of the lessons that at least, I was able to better articulate by working on this project is to take a look at the long view of how things change and why things change and under what circumstances they change, and realizing that every generation approached race and Civil War memory in a different way that brings us closer to where we are now, but in the moment it seems like gradualness, unsatisfactory gradualness. And also recognizing the fact that because of the complexity of how change happens, being okay with the fact that taking these monuments down, we didn't wake up the morning after that happened and everything was fine in Richmond.
Right. Right.
Well, obviously, this city, like every city, has its own, general or specific problems. The housing crisis in this town is impossible. I don't know how people who have lower incomes can get by living in this city.
Yeah.
That's an extreme problem that has its roots in the racial history of this place that ain't going to be solved by taking a monument down. But, at St. Paul's, they took down the visible Confederate flags from they weren't obvious in the space. They're on some plaques, on some kneelers and whatnot. And took those down, and a couple years later took those down immediately in 2016. In 2020, took down the Davis family plaques and rededicated the windows, which is helpful because they don't depict Leon Davis. So you say, okay, they're dedicated to something else now. Not these men. And, recognizing that the problems that this racial history has given us is deeper than just the symbols. And the symbols are important. It's good that those monuments are down. It's good that St. Paul's has disavowed, or at least better understands the complexity of its own racial history and its own Civil War memory. But taking this deep dive into not just looking at, well, were they slave owners or not? Or when did they put these windows up or not? That's an interesting point in time, but kind of getting deeper into how did they practice their lived theology of race in their daily lives reveals such a deeper, more complex set of problems that we can kind of look back with hindsight now and begin to figure out what obligation the congregation has to the past and to Richmond in the present. And it's the same way with the, I think with the monuments is that kind of the monuments coming down was a symptom of knowing our history, collective history better. But that wasn't the start or the end of grappling with that past, is that it just gives us more space to understand how things like gentrification and the housing crisis were created and how they impact people now is, something we're still grappling with. And at St. Paul's, we kind of reaffirmed a commitment to being conscientious and up to speed on racial issues that are facing us as a congregation and facing the city of Richmond and Commonwealth of Virginia. But there's still a lot of work. There's still a lot of work to be done in those lines. This is a church that, has historically had the influence and wealth to be able to do something about whatever problem they diagnose. Kind of in the totality of the history, maybe it'd be easier to sit back and say, well, maybe we don't do anything. Maybe we sit here and contemplate what it means to be a white church in this day and age.
Yeah.
And what it means to kind of divest ourselves of whiteness, however we define it, before we try to go out and solve someone else's problems.
Yeah. Well, I think you've done really good work here. And I think for a lot of places, this isn't obviously the first step the church has ever taken. But I think in terms of writing its history, and as we well know, nothing lasts forever. It's going to be rewritten, hopefully.
Oh, yeah.
But a lot of people, unfortunately, in the last 10 years or so, they use rewriting history as a pejorative. Like, you're rewriting history. But this is somewhat, is this the first book about St. Paul's?
No, there's been some, there was a 2-volume history published in 1925.
Okay.
And then a small 150th anniversary volume that was published in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
But nothing like this. And certainly, as I fully expect in 100 years, when the next historian takes a look at St. Paul's history, they're gonna say, well, this guy meant well.
Yeah.
This book meant well, and it's certainly a marker of some of the changes that were happening, and it's a product of its time. But boy, he just wasn't getting it right.
That could be, but I think a lot of places needed to be doing things like this, some of which I have worked at and are way behind in terms of telling their story. So, this is in some ways just the tip of the iceberg in terms of Richmond history, but it's an impressive piece of work. You've done the archival research and it's well written, well argued. So I know you said you didn't really want to make capital A argument, but I think you do. And I think academics will be able to follow that. So, So yeah, congratulations, man. On good talking with you about it.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the space to do this.
All right. No problem. All right. That was my talk with Chris Graham. Once again, his book is Faith, Race, and the Lost Cause, Confessions of a Southern Church. It's going for about $29 in paperback on Amazon and $27.55 in Kindle. I won't even quote you the hardcover price because it's really expensive, but if you've got Bezos money, maybe you can buy the hardcover. I'm never sure what's going on with publishers and why they price things the way they do, why a hardcover might be fairly cheap or it might be super expensive. Sometimes they just issue a paperback, other times it's a hardcover first and then a paperback, or both at the same time. It's all over the place, and they don't tell you anything. You just kind of sit and wait, and the book comes out, and it's priced what it's priced. So sometimes it's a pleasant surprise, and sometimes a not so pleasant surprise. And I'm not sure why my hardcover and softcover for my book, Marching Masters, is going for the same price right now. But anyway, I've got a second book on Johnny Cash if you want to check that out, and not sure what I'm doing for the next book. But enough about me. Go and read Chris's book. It's very informative, well-written, well-researched, and I think you'll enjoy it if you like issues concerning the Civil War and race relations, and also Richmond history. And speaking of Richmond, we are in peak pollen levels right now. I've been suffering the last couple days. It's been really bad. It always feels bad, but this year it feels especially worse, especially since it's been so dry and kind of windy, and the pollen is just piled up. It's just ridiculous. So feeling a little better today than I was yesterday and the day before, I think. Usually I kind of get used to it, but the transition can be rough, especially when it's like cold one day, hot the next, then cold and hot all over the place. It's supposed to hit 90 today, so we're probably going to have the warmest April on record. But at least baseball has started. Red Sox are not playing great. They're around 500, and I don't know if they have the pitching and the overall balance that they need to really excel this year. But hopefully it'll be a better year than last year and an entertaining one. Not sure how these new rules are making the game go along faster. I don't really think a faster game is necessarily a more interesting game. But anyway, they keep messing with things, and I don't know. I haven't seen enough baseball yet this year to really tell. Last year was pretty frustrating and often boring, but that's because my team was losing. Well, I hope your team is doing fine if you have one, and you are enjoying some spring weather. So I will be talking with you again sometime, maybe. All right, take care. Bye.